Julian Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city lights reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes. The legal document in his hand felt heavier than the billions in his corporate accounts. His grandfather's will was infuriatingly clear. Julian had exactly 30 days to marry, or the controlling shares of Vance Global would be surrendered to the board of directors. More specifically, they would fall into the greedy palms of Arthur Pendleton. Julian crumpled the paper, tossing it onto his mahogany desk. His closest confidant, Elias Grant, sat on the leather sofa, swirling a glass of scotch. Elias pointed out that Julian just needed a signature, a woman who would take a paycheck, smile for the cameras, and never demand a real marriage. Julian scoffed at the idea of finding someone who would not try to claw her way into his actual life. As he said it, his gaze shifted to the hallway. A young woman in a grey uniform was quietly emptying the recycling bins. It was Clara. She had been cleaning the executive floor for 3 weeks. Julian had never truly looked at her until tonight. He walked out of his office, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her faded work clothes. He told her to stop what she was doing. Clara straightened up, holding her cleaning cart steady. She did not lower her eyes, nor did she flinch at his tone. She simply asked if he needed his trash emptied, her voice steady and unimpressed. Julian studied her. There was a quiet dignity about her, a hardened pride that money clearly could not buy. He offered her $1 million to sign a marriage contract for a single year. Clara looked at him, then at the mop in her hand, and let out a dry laugh. She told him that just because she cleaned his floors did not mean she was for sale. Julian stepped closer, used to people bowing to his wealth. He told her she was throwing away a lifetime of security out of stubborn pride. Clara met his gaze directly and replied that her pride was the only thing she had left, and it was significantly more expensive than $1 million. Despite her refusal, the eviction notice she received the very next morning forced her hand. They signed the papers in a sterile law office. There was no romance, no celebration, only the scratch of pens on thick parchment. The wedding was a quiet, cold affair at the courthouse. When they arrived at the Vance estate, Arthur Pendleton was already waiting in the foyer, offering mock congratulations. Pendleton looked Clara up and down with barely concealed disgust, noting her lack of designer labels. Clara did not shrink under his gaze. She offered a perfectly polite smile and told Arthur that she had always found true wealth whispered while new money screamed. Pendleton's face tightened, and Julian had to mask a sudden smirk. Clara was not going to be an easy pawn for anyone. The first few weeks in the penthouse were a battle of wills. Julian expected her to spend his money, to redecorate, to mold herself into a typical high-society wife. Instead, Clara wore her own modest clothes. She cooked her own simple meals. One evening, an aggressive foreign investor cornered Clara at a cocktail party, attempting to mock her humble origins. Julian started to step in, but Clara dismantled the man's argument using flawless corporate terminology, leaving the investor speechless. Later that night, Julian found her in the dimly lit kitchen. She handed him a cup of black coffee, exactly the way he liked it, without a word. Their fingers brushed. For a brief second, the icy wall between them cracked. Julian realized he was drawn to her quiet strength, and Clara saw the exhausted man beneath the billionaire facade. The fragile peace shattered 2 days later. Julian walked into his office to find a folder on his desk, placed there by his private investigator. He opened it, and the color drained from his face. He called Clara into the room, throwing a photograph onto the glass table. It was a picture of a younger Clara, standing next to Richard Thorne. Julian demanded to know why the daughter of the man whose company Vance Global had ruthlessly dismantled was pretending to be a cleaner. Clara looked at the photo, her eyes filling with a painful, guarded sorrow. She did not yell. She quietly explained that after Vance Global and Arthur Pendleton drove her father to bankruptcy, she had to renounce her own name to escape the massive debts and protect her sick mother. She had not come for revenge. She had simply been trying to survive the ruin Julian's world had created. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian felt a profound, sickening guilt, but his pride made him cold. He told her to stay in her wing of the penthouse until the contract expired. For days they lived like ghosts passing in the halls, The silence was their weapon, but it cut them both. Julian found himself unable to focus. He noticed small things, like the way Clara had subtly reorganized his chaotic desk notes to make his work easier. One afternoon, Clara returned to her room to find an envelope on her bed. Inside was the deed to her late father's childhood home in the countryside, fully paid off alongside a completely blank card. No grand apologies, no expensive jewelry, just a silent, monumental gesture of care. Before the wounds could heal, Arthur Pendleton made his move. Pendleton had also discovered Clara's true identity. He cornered them both in the boardroom before the annual shareholders' gala. With a smug smile, Pendleton threatened to expose Clara to the media as a corporate spy, claiming the marriage was a fraudulent plot to steal company secrets. This would void Julian's inheritance and allow Pendleton to seize the CEO position. Pendleton demanded Julian step down immediately or watch Clara be thrown into a federal investigation. Julian's fists clenched. He looked at Clara, ready to sacrifice his grandfather's company to keep her safe. But Clara reached out and gently took Julian's hand, her grip firm and fearless. She looked at Pendleton and told him they would see him at the gala. The ballroom was packed with reporters, investors and elite society members. Just as Pendleton walked toward the main microphone to announce his takeover, Clara stepped smoothly into his path. She took the microphone first. Her voice echoed through the grand hall as she introduced herself as Clara Thorne. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but she did not stop there. She pulled a thick stack of documents from her clutch. She calmly explained that while she was working in the building, she had come across the offshore accounts Pendleton used to embezzle funds from Vance Global, the very same illegal tactics he had used to frame and destroy her father years ago. Copies of the dossier were simultaneously handed to every board member in the front row. Pendleton lunged forward, his face red with rage, but security quickly restrained him. The room erupted into chaos. Investors turned their backs on Arthur in real time, the media flashing photographs of his humiliating downfall. Later that night, the penthouse was entirely quiet. Julian stood by the window, looking out over the city just as he had on the night they met. Clara walked up behind him. Julian finally turned, all his arrogance gone. He told her he was sorry for everything his family had cost hers, and he offered to tear up the marriage contract right then and there, leaving her with the money and her freedom. Clara stepped closer, looking up into his eyes. She told him that she did not want her freedom anymore. She wanted him. Julian pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a desperate, lingering tenderness that erased all the bitter weeks between them. There were no cameras, no board members, just a man and a woman who had finally found the truth in each other. Months passed, and the cold corporate empire of Vance Global was transformed. Together, Julian and Clara launched the Thorne Vance Initiative, a branch of the company dedicated to supporting struggling family businesses. They stood side by side in the new headquarters, equal partners in business and in life. Clara looked out at the skyline, no longer a stranger hiding in the shadows, but a queen in her own right, holding the hand of the man who had finally learned the true value of love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time. The heavy, gold-foiled envelope felt like poison in Adrian Sterling's hands. He sat in the private lounge of his elite athletic club, staring at the wedding invitation. Vanessa Cross, the woman who had shattered their engagement a year ago to climb a higher social ladder, was getting married to a foreign shipping magnate. The invitation was a calculated insult, a public challenge to see if Adrian would show up alone and defeated. His best friend, Marcus Reed, leaned against the bar and suggested Adrian just throw the paper into the fireplace. But Adrian was a man built on pride. He refused to give Vanessa the satisfaction of a victory. He needed a date. Not a supermodel, not a socialite who would gossip to the press, but someone real enough to make Vanessa question her own choices. The next morning, the chaotic noise of a local coffee shop provided a stark contrast to his silent penthouse. Adrian was aggressively typing an email on his phone when someone bumped hard into his shoulder. Scalding hot tea splashed across his customized Italian leather shoes. He looked up, ready to unleash his famously ruthless temper, but the words died in his throat. Sienna Hayes stood there, holding an empty cup. She was a kindergarten teacher with ink-stained fingers, messy hair, and an expression entirely devoid of intimidation. Adrian expected her to cower or apologize profusely. Instead, Sienna crossed her arms and pointed out that standing in the middle of the pickup counter, while staring at a screen, was an excellent way to get completely drenched. Adrian was stunned. No one spoke to him like that. Intrigued by her absolute lack of deference, he made a snap decision. He bought her a new tea, sat her down, and offered to completely fund her school's failing arts program if she would pretend to be his fiercely devoted fiancée for Vanessa's week-long destination wedding in Italy. Sienna initially laughed in his face, calling him completely delusional, but when she thought about her students drawing with broken crayons on scrap paper, her conscience won. A week later, they arrived at a breathtaking villa in Lake Como. The agreement was clear. No real feelings, just a flawless performance. Upon arrival, Vanessa greeted them in the grand foyer, her eyes narrowing as she inspected Sienna. Vanessa expected a polished, vapid heiress. Instead, she found a woman who politely declined the champagne, wore an elegant but distinctly unbranded vintage dress, and looked at the opulent surroundings with polite indifference rather than awe. Adrian felt a surge of triumph as Vanessa's fake smile faltered. The charade proved harder to maintain than either anticipated. Surrounded by cutthroat socialites, Sienna and Adrian had to constantly touch, whisper, and act hopelessly in love. At a yacht party on the third day, a wealthy investor cornered Sienna, mockingly asking what prestigious family she belonged to. Adrian stepped in to rescue her, but Sienna calmly replied that her family dealt in shaping the future, not inheriting the past, casually mentioning her work with children. The investor walked away, thoroughly outclassed. Later, away from the cameras, Adrian found Sienna standing barefoot on the villa's private dock, shivering slightly in the evening breeze. He took off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders. For a moment, the transaction faded. Sienna looked up at him, her defenses momentarily dropping, and admitted that his world was exhausting. Adrian quietly agreed, his hand lingering on her arm just a second longer than the contract required. The turning point happened after a disastrous dinner where Vanessa deliberately brought up Adrian's high school days, trying to embarrass him. Later, in their shared suite, Adrian vented his frustration, pacing the floor. Sienna watched him quietly before finally speaking. She told him he had not changed at all since St. Jude's Academy. Adrian froze. He demanded to know how she knew about his boarding school. Sienna took a deep breath, her eyes heavy with old pain. She revealed that 10 years ago, her name was Sienna Miller. She had been the awkward, overweight scholarship student that everyone tormented, everyone except Adrian, who had once defended her in the library and given her his coat when hers was thrown in the mud. After her family went quietly bankrupt, she changed her last name and reinvented herself, hoping to forget that life entirely. She had recognized him instantly at the coffee shop, but the boy who once showed her kindness had turned into a cold, transactional billionaire. Adrian felt as if the floor had vanished beneath him. He had hired a stranger, only to realize he had bought the time of the only person from his past he had genuinely cared about. His shock quickly morphed into defensive anger. He accused her of manipulating the coffee shop encounter to get money out of him. The accusation hit Sienna like a physical blow. She did not yell. She simply placed the diamond engagement ring on the nightstand, her voice perfectly steady as she told him that his wealth had made him entirely blind to reality. She walked out of the room, leaving Adrian in a deafening silence. For the next 2 days, they barely spoke. The distance was agonizing. Adrian tried to fix it the only way he knew how. He quietly arranged for a massive state-of-the-art playground to be built at her school, ensuring his name was left completely off the donation records. Vanessa, sensing the fracture between them, saw an opportunity to finally destroy Adrian's composure. She paid off a hotel staff member to dig into Sienna's background. On the night of the lavish rehearsal dinner, Vanessa clinked her glass, demanding the room's attention. With a malicious grin, she announced that Adrian's beautiful fiancée was nothing but a fraud. a poverty-stricken public school teacher hired to play dress-up, whose own family had lost everything in a pathetic bankruptcy. The room fell completely silent. Adrian moved to shield Sienna, ready to tear Vanessa apart, but Sienna stepped gently past him. Sienna stood tall in the center of the ballroom. She did not deny a single word. She looked directly at the crowd of billionaires and calmly stated that she was indeed a teacher, that she worked hard for every dollar she earned, and that she was incredibly proud of surviving her family's collapse. She turned to Vanessa and softly added that having no money was a temporary circumstance, but having no grace was a permanent tragedy. The room did not erupt into mockery. Instead, an older, highly respected duchess began a slow, deliberate clap, which quickly spread through the room. The elite crowd was charmed by Sienna's absolute authenticity. Vanessa stood frozen, her face pale. Her own groom, utterly disgusted by her cruel and unhinged behavior, walked out of the ballroom, effectively ending their relationship on the spot. Later that night, Adrian knocked on the door of Sienna's guest room. He did not wear his expensive suit. He looked tired, vulnerable, and completely sincere. He did not offer her a new contract or more money. He offered a profound, quiet apology. He told her that he had spent his life building a fortress of money to keep people out, but she was the only one he actually wanted inside. He asked for her forgiveness, not as a billionaire, but as the boy from the library who had finally remembered how to be kind. Sienna looked at him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes, and finally let out a soft, forgiving smile. 2 years later, the heavy doors of St. Jude's Academy opened to a bright spring morning. Adrian and Sienna walked hand in hand across the campus, no longer pretending. They had married in a quiet, intimate ceremony far away from the cameras of high society. Adrian had stepped down as CEO of Sterling Capital, leaving the toxic corporate world behind, to run a philanthropic foundation alongside his wife. They stopped by the old library, sharing a quiet kiss in the exact spot where they had first met as children. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time. The crystal glass shattered against the marble fireplace of the Kane Enterprises boardroom. Sebastian Kane did not flinch, his jaw set in a rigid line as he stared down his mother, Eleanor. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture impeccably straight and her gaze sharp enough to cut diamond. Eleanor informed him that the board of directors was losing faith in his reckless lifestyle. She delivered her ultimatum with chilling calm. If Sebastian did not present a respectable, devoted wife within 48 hours to stabilize the company's public image, she would personally orchestrate a vote of no confidence and strip him of his title as chief executive officer. Sebastian scoffed, turning to his trusted legal advisor Benedict Cole, who simply offered a grim nod of confirmation. Eleanor had cornered him. He needed a bride immediately, someone entirely immune to the intoxicating allure of his wealth, someone who would treat the marriage as nothing more than a rigorous corporate assignment. He marched out of the boardroom and nearly collided with a stack of heavily bound financial reports. Behind the reports stood Margot Ellis, his newly hired personal assistant. She had been working for him for barely a month, enduring his grueling demands and famously short temper with infuriating composure. Sebastian watched as she calmly knelt to gather the scattered documents, her plain grey blouse and worn shoes completely out of place on the executive floor. He realized she was exactly what he needed. She was efficient, entirely unsentimental, and clearly desperate enough for a paycheck to tolerate him. He called her into his office and offered her $2 million to act as his wife for exactly 1 year. Margot placed the neatly stacked reports on his desk, her expression completely unreadable. She told him that she was hired to manage his schedule, not his personal crises. Sebastian leaned forward, accustomed to getting his way, and reminded her that her salary barely covered her rent. Margot did not blink. She replied that her dignity was not an item he could purchase at a discount, regardless of how desperate his mother had made him. Despite her ironclad refusal, an unforeseen financial emergency forced Margot to reconsider by nightfall. The wedding took place the very next afternoon in the sterile, quiet chambers of a local courthouse. There was no joy, only the heavy silence of a signed contract. When they arrived at the sprawling Kane estate, Eleanor was waiting in the grand hallway. She inspected Margot like a disappointing piece of antique furniture, making a cruel comment about her inexpensive coat. Margot did not lower her eyes. She offered Eleanor a perfectly measured smile and stated that true elegance was found in character, not on a price tag. Eleanor's eyes narrowed with venomous realization. Margot was not going to be a quiet, easily manipulated victim. Living together in the massive estate was a quiet battle of endurance. Sebastian expected Margot to immediately upgrade her wardrobe and spend her days lounging by the pool. Instead, she continued waking up at dawn, organizing his files, and refusing every extravagant gift he tried to send her way. During a high-stakes dinner with international investors, a rival CEO tried to humiliate Sebastian by aggressively questioning his recent market losses. Before Sebastian could retaliate, Margot smoothly intervened. She effortlessly dismantled the rival's argument with flawless financial data, leaving the table in stunned silence. Later that evening, Sebastian found her asleep at her desk in the study, exhausted from managing both his life and his business. He gently draped his expensive cashmere throw over her shoulders. She shifted in her sleep, leaning slightly into his touch. In that quiet, darkened room, the rigid billionaire felt a strange, undeniable ache in his chest. He was falling for his own assistant. The fragile piece shattered violently on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sebastian entered his office to find his mother waiting for him, a manila folder resting on his desk. Eleanor smiled wickedly as she told him to look at the reality of his perfect wife. Inside were photographs of Margot visiting a specialized pediatric care facility. There were medical bills and birth certificates. Margot had a 5-year-old son named Leo, born with a rare respiratory condition, from a tragic relationship long before she met Sebastian. Eleanor delighted in telling him that Margot was nothing but a calculating gold digger, using his vast fortune to fund her hidden baggage. Sebastian felt a suffocating wave of betrayal. When Margot walked into the office, he threw the photographs onto the floor. He demanded to know why she had lied to him. Margot looked at the scattered pictures of her sick child, her eyes filling with a desperate, fierce pain. She told him that Leo was not baggage, but her entire world. She had taken the contract solely to pay for his life-saving treatments, keeping him a secret because she knew the ruthless Kane family would use a sick child as a pawn. Pride and anger consumed Sebastian. He ordered her to move to the guest house, enforcing a brutal, freezing silence between them. He ignored her in the halls and spoke to her only when cameras were present, but the silence slowly poisoned him. He could not stop thinking about the agonizing terror she must have felt, trying to keep her son alive entirely on her own. Without telling her, Sebastian drove to the care facility. He watched through the glass door as Margot read a story to a fragile little boy connected to a breathing monitor. He saw the pure, unconditional love radiating from her, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating mother he had grown up with. That night, Margot received a call from the hospital administrator. A completely anonymous donor had just cleared Leo's massive medical debt and fully funded the hospital's pediatric research wing. She knew instantly who had done it. It was a silent, monumental gesture that spoke louder than any apology. Before they could bridge the gap, Eleanor launched her final devastating attack. Furious that Sebastian had not filed for immediate divorce, she invited the most vicious tabloid journalists to the annual Kane Enterprises charity gala. Midway through the evening, Eleanor took the stage. She announced she had a special presentation regarding the integrity of the Kane family. She intended to project Margot's medical documents and expose the illegitimate child to the press, destroying Margot's reputation and forcing Sebastian's hand. As the screen behind Eleanor flickered to life, Margot stood frozen in the crowd, her heart pounding with sheer terror at the thought of her fragile son being dragged into the brutal spotlight of the media. But the image never appeared. Sebastian stormed the stage, signaling the sound engineers to cut the power to the projector. He took the microphone from his mother's trembling hand. The ballroom fell dead silent. Sebastian looked directly at the cameras and announced that he and his wife were thrilled to finally share some wonderful news. He declared that he was officially adopting Margot's son, Leo, and that they were building a new family together. He then turned to Eleanor, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He exposed her attempt to humiliate a sick child just to maintain corporate control. The elite crowd erupted in disgusted whispers. Eleanor's closest allies and board members physically turned their backs on her, horrified by her lack of basic humanity. Stripped of her power and public respect, Eleanor fled the stage in total humiliation. Later that night, the estate was finally peaceful. Sebastian found Margot standing in the nursery they had quietly begun preparing. He walked up behind her, entirely stripping away his pride. He told her he was profoundly sorry for reacting with anger when she needed protection the most. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life being the father Leo deserved and the husband she had always been worthy of. Margot turned around, tears of genuine relief falling down her cheeks. She did not say a word. She simply stepped into his arms, burying her face in his chest, finally allowing herself to be held. 2 years later, the heavy doors of the Kane estate opened to the sound of echoing laughter. Sebastian was kneeling on the grass, teaching a healthy, energetic Leo how to throw a baseball. Margot stood on the patio, watching her 2 boys with a soft smile, resting her hand on her visibly pregnant belly. Sebastian looked up, catching her eye, and the sheer adoration in his gaze proved that the most ruthless billionaire in the city had been completely conquered by love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents the 3 stories as variations of the same emotional journey, showing how love begins inside relationships shaped by money, pressure, and unequal power. Julian and Clara enter a forced marriage built on a legal deadline and financial survival. Adrian and Sienna pretend to be engaged so he can protect his pride at a wedding. Sebastian and Margot accept a contract marriage because his position is threatened and her son needs medical care. In every case, the relationship starts as a performance, but the emotional consequences become real. The psychological analysis focuses on pride and emotional armor. The 3 billionaires use wealth, control, and authority to avoid vulnerability. Julian assumes every problem can be solved with a contract. Adrian treats affection as a strategy for defeating an old humiliation. Sebastian believes money gives him the right to judge Margot before understanding her fear. Their cold behavior is also a defense created by betrayal, family pressure, and the belief that showing emotion means losing control. The women challenge this worldview through dignity and self-respect. Clara refuses to be treated as something that can be purchased. Sienna does not allow social status to define her value as a teacher or a woman. Margot protects her son even when secrecy places her marriage at risk. Their financial vulnerability never becomes moral weakness. The men possess wealth, but the women possess the courage and emotional strength needed to transform the relationship. The infographic also highlights social issues. Class inequality influences every decision, from eviction and medical debt to failing schools and ruined family businesses. Reputation becomes another form of control. Corporate boards, wealthy families, investors, journalists, and elite guests pressure the characters to perform ideal versions of success. The women are first viewed as cleaners, assistants, teachers, or outsiders, yet they prove that intelligence and character are not determined by income, clothing, or social origin. Each romance develops through 5 stages. A contract creates the connection, conflict destroys the illusion of safety, a hidden truth causes mistrust, and a protective act reveals genuine care. Julian restores Clara's family home, Adrian supports Sienna's school without taking public credit, and Sebastian protects Margot's son from debt and humiliation. These gestures are no longer attempts to buy affection. They are sacrifices that show empathy, responsibility, and change. The final message is that redemption becomes possible when power is replaced by partnership. Love does not erase the harm caused by arrogance, suspicion, or inequality, but it forces the characters to confront those failures honestly. The stories remain compelling because cold luxury is placed beside human warmth, powerful men learn humility, and underestimated women become the moral center of the narrative. In the end, the true transformation is not the marriage itself. It is the decision to see another person fully, respect their dignity, and build a future based on trust rather than control.